The optics are startling. Russia bombing a children's hospital in Kyiv, while the leader of the country that holds the rotating presidency of the European Council wrapped up a so-called peace tour that included stops in Moscow, Baku, Beijing. At no point during his Kremlin visit did Hungary's Viktor Orban denounce Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, nor, by the way, display an EU flag. Orban, who waited until after the French elections to announce that his Fidesz party was joining forces with Marine Le Pen's national rally in the next European Parliament. Their new voting bloc, called Patriots for Europe, it's to be chaired by Le Pen's lead candidate for the recent snap French elections, 28-year-old Jordan Bardella. Will the national rally stick to its newfound support for Ukraine? Will the duo supplant Italy's Giorgia Meloni as the leader of the nationalist right in Europe? After recent European elections, it's the start of a new term in Brussels, too. The last 5 years saw a pooling of resources in the fight against COVID, the first ever EU mutualization of debt among the 27, the Green Deal, the emergence of an embryo of a common European defense. As Orban and friends get set to travel to the NATO summit in Washington, what's in store for Europe over the next 5 years? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about Europe's new League of Nationalists. And with us from Brussels, French member of the European Parliament from the Green Party, Gwendoline Delbos-Corfield. Thank you for being with us.
Hello, my pleasure.
With us as well, Anne-Sylvaine Chassani, senior editor for the Financial Times, who these days usually hangs her hat across the channel. But you've graced us with a French elections coverage being the reason.
French elections.
All right. Also with us, Ulrika Franca, senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you for joining us.
For having me.
And from Rome, commentator Thibault Musergue, the author of Post-Populisme in French, a book about how the rise of nationalism has come about in the past years. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, two announcements. First off, we reached out to a host of lawmakers from the Patriots for Europe voting bloc. None accepted our offer to join this conversation. The second, well, you can listen, like, and subscribe to the France 24 debate on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other fine streaming services. Let's begin with what's been the image of the last 24 hours. Flags at half-mast in Ukraine one day after a massive daytime barrage across the country that left at least 41 dead. The United Nations says initial evidence seems to debunk Kremlin claims that it was Ukrainian anti-aircraft fire that's to blame, instead pointing to the probability that it's a Russian Kh-101 cruise missile that directly struck a 10-story building.
At the moment, all the patients from the damaged units are either discharged or evacuated to other hospitals. Those who require medical aid are being treated in parts of the hospital that have not been damaged. Debris removal is underway.
And this daytime attack comes just days after Viktor Orban was welcomed to the Kremlin. His surprise trip follows a visit to Kyiv, where last week he met with Volodymyr Zelensky. Again, a reminder, since July the 1st, Hungary holds the rotating presidency of the European Council.
The Hungarian government sees the next 6 months and the work that will be done then as a peace mission.
Gwendoline Delbos-Corfield, your reaction when you heard that Viktor Orban was in Russia, then to a summit of Turkic nations in Azerbaijan, and then China?
Well, I'm sorry to say that I was not surprised, and I'm not happy about this. I mean, there's no pride in this. I think that no one in the parliament that warned about this, and we were a few MEPs. We were a number of MEPs working very hard on the topic, saying this is a huge problem, this incoming presidency. Some of my colleagues were as vocal as me, and the parliament itself, as a majority, took a number of stands on this upcoming Hungarian presidency a few months ago when we knew about it, and we said exactly what would happen. You know, the only thing that surprised me is that it didn't even take him one day. It was on the very first day of his presidency that he said, I'm going to to Moscow, and that's exactly what we said. We said he will be putting on the agenda and inviting the worst dictatorships in the world, and he will say to Europe, I don't care with values and I don't care with what you are saying in the Parliament, in the Council or in the Commission. So sadly, I am not surprised, and I really wonder what all these leaders are going to do about this.
There's a meeting of EU ambassadors on Wednesday. Politico reporting that there's some who even want Hungary's EU presidency to be revoked early. Does that seem realistic to you?
No, I'm sorry to say it doesn't seem realistic. We said for 6 months they had all of the tools. These presidencies have no obligation in the treaties. It was easy to be done. They didn't even deprive this presidency from a few things. We were just asking to deprive them from the rule of law issues. They didn't even do that. So why would they react now? They are going to do like they've been doing for more than a decade. They will meet Friday in Coreper. They will say how appalled they are. They will ask Viktor Orban, Prime Minister, questions. And then they will say, this should really not come back and you should not do it again. And he will go on doing it until December.
Ulrike Franke, your thoughts on, because this gets into the way Brussels works. You have this one nation out of 27 that really is an outlier for a long time, Hungary. It's given the EU presidency. Some say it was done at this particular moment in time because of the fact that since Parliament doesn't sit for part of it, they're still figuring out who gets the top jobs. This is when he could do the least damage. Still, do you think it was a good idea?
Quite honestly, as long as Hungary is a member of the EU, I'm not a big fan of saying, well, you're a member, but you're a second-class member and somehow you can't do the roles that all the other members do. Obviously, Viktor Orban is a really difficult leader to work with. And importantly, during these trips, he didn't, in fact, speak for the EU because he didn't consult with the EU. He didn't have the EU message in his bag, if you like. And that's the biggest problem. But I don't think it's the right way to kind of deprive the country of the rotating presidency. But yeah, I think the biggest problem really is the message here. I mean, that he went and met with these leaders, you could turn this and say, actually, maybe this is one of the few people who actually can still talk to Putin and convey a message. I don't quite believe it, but, I'm kind of trying to spin this in a positive way. But for this to work, then he would have needed to actually convey any kind of EU positions. And from what we know, he didn't do this, and he didn't denounce Russia's attack and Putin's attacks. So yeah, this is really not helpful, and it just shows disunity in the EU.
Yeah, because when he was in Kyiv, he got a polite reception from his Ukrainian counterpart. Ukraine and Hungary, who are neighbors. Last week, there kind of was a little bit that hope that, okay, maybe he can be a back channel for something, Ulrike.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, Volodymyr Zelensky these days, understandably, basically is willing to talk to everybody because obviously his main role, his main job is to convince everybody to support Ukraine and to kind of make them understand what is happening in Ukraine. So I think it's perfectly legitimate and fine that he met with him, but clearly he didn't quite break through with his message, and it wasn't possible to kind of convince Orban to pass a message to Putin, as you say, become this kind of back channel negotiator. But very honestly, I don't think this was really expected.
All right. In Warsaw Monday, the same Volodymyr Zelensky standing alongside the Polish leader Donald Tusk, who had some choice words for the Hungarian leader.
I dedicate these words to Viktor Orban. History remembers politicians who told themselves and others that they were working for a just peace, but in fact worked for capitulation. These politicians have written themselves on the shameful pages of history.
Worked for capitulation and
very strong words, very strong words. I think it's, the whole episode kind of shows the debate and how, Europe is not a very, homogeneous group, and we knew that. So I don't think it's like, it's definitely not surprising coming out of, Orban, but I don't think we should. And obviously, all the reactions have been the right one. The council reaction, everybody's kind of toned down and made sure that he was not speaking on behalf of Europe. We're going to have trawling from Orban until December. We just have to make sure that we are ready for it. But it's going to happen. So
is that what this is about? This trip that he did, this trip to Russia and China. Is it to troll?
I think it's just to show he exists and he's that he's a different voice. He's speaking obviously to part of the population in Europe who are quite skeptical about supporting Ukraine all the way through. So a lot, and we've seen it in the French elections. The far right, the Rassemblement National, is changed its tune on Ukraine, but is not really supportive of sending very offensive weapons and so on. It's very reflective of a part of the populations in Europe that a bit wary about this war that is lasting a long time, and they're not really seeing a resolution. So, in a way, it's as long as the bloc stands behind Ukraine, ships the military aid, practically doing the right thing, I think we can get by with Orban on these subjects for another 6 months.
They can get by for until the end of the year. Thibault Muzel, it's a platform, right, for this presidency of the European Council. I guess what Americans would call a bully pulpit, even if it doesn't have very many concrete roles other than holding a gavel at meetings. So between now and December, Viktor Orban's message, how much traction will it get?
Well, he's going to get traction mostly at home, and that's what's intended. I mean, Viktor Orban thinks nationally first, and he thinks about consolidating power at home. Right now, he has been in difficulty over the past few months with a couple of scandals, and he wants to make sure he knows that his propaganda machine, because we need to call it what it is, a propaganda machine at home, is working well on this issue of peace. That there is a whole section of Hungarian society that is very worried about this issue. So showing himself as a leader of Europe, as a leader of peace, is something that works at home. And as has already been said, this is also linked to his European project, which is the Patriots of Europe, and showing this sort of dissenting voice that allows him to put himself as the leader of illiberalism in Europe, illiberalism that he has basically theorized 10 years ago in Bajletusnad in a famous speech, in which already showed that the models that he was seeking were not in the West, but rather in the East. I think in his speech back then he mentioned Turkey, China, India as models for the future. So it's all part of a package that he's selling to the Hungarian people, to his home constituency, basically, but also in Europe, not necessarily to all the peoples of Europe, because generally people outside of Hungary don't really care about Viktor Orban, but rather about the elites that, at least to some extent, less than before, but to some extent, are still fascinated to a certain extent by him and by his power.
Yeah, can Viktor Orban sing from the same hymn page as the other nationalists in that internationale that he's building? Orban on all fronts, the Hungarian leader, Monday, announcing the arrival of Marine Le Pen's national rally to his new voting bloc in the European Parliament. James Vazina has that story.
Failing to get a majority in France, the country's biggest far-right party is looking to make an impact on the European level. The new Patriots for Europe group was formed a week ago after the Identity and Democracy group disbanded. And France's National Rally hasn't just joined the new camp, it's taken control.
I must excuse Jordan Bardela's absence. He's been elected president of this group, and this is an honor for the French camp and our 30 members of the European Parliament.
That's the largest delegation in the group, which itself is now third in the European Parliament, ahead of the European Conservatives and Reformists, with 84 MEPs. The National Rally's 28-year-old leader will preside over a coalition that includes parties from across the continent, such as Hungary's Fidesz, Italy's Lega and Spain's Vox. But the French party's move now raises questions over its stance on the war in Ukraine. Throughout his legislative campaigning, Jordan Bardella repeatedly stated that he backed armed support for Kyiv.
I support Ukraine, support deliveries to help the country defend itself. I want to provide ammunition as well as logistical and operational aid, weapons to help them hold on strong on the front line.
But by joining the group, France's far-right party is aligning itself with Hungary's Viktor Orban, who's known for his pro-Russian stance and for blocking EU aid initiatives for Ukraine.
And Sylvain Chassani, French voters, you heard that clip of Jordan Bardella, do they believe him when he says we're for delivering weapons to Ukraine, or they know that that's not his stance?
I think it's, the Rassemblement National has shifted its stance on Ukraine because they wanted to be seen more moderate, as part of let's not frighten the French too much, and let's be a bit more, let's shift more towards the moderate center. And the consensus in France is still that, Russia is the bad guy, and we need to support Ukraine. But this new, this
is Jordan Bardella telling the truth in that clip?
Obviously not, right? I mean, they're saying that they're supporting Ukraine with all sorts of conditions, right? And so no one really believes that they've all of a sudden turned into supporters of Ukraine. And actually, this membership to the Orban group shows that they are still very, very, ambiguous about this subject. I think it's more kind of a clarification. It's more, confirmation of their true pro-Kremlin stance. I mean, they've really shifted now, so they're not going to go back to the previous. Marine Le Pen went to Moscow in 2017 before the presidential election. But
Thibault Muzelk, when you look at this from Italy, where you've been residing, how different is the reaction vis-a-vis Russia? We know that Giorgia Meloni has been strongly in favor of NATO, has supported it strongly. Can the National Rally change to the extent that it says it has?
Well, obviously, it hasn't changed as much as it has claimed to during the campaign. I mean, it seems to be very clear now. If you compare and in ID and now with the Patriots for Europe, they are at home in some ways. They are in a place where they are among people who think alike, unlike ECR, which is very pro-West and very pro-NATO. So in some there is an ideological logic to that. The problem is that Jordan Bardella during the campaign has been selling a completely different product to the French people. And I think between the two rounds, we saw another face of the Rassemblement National, which was shown by Marine Le Pen, not by Jordan Bardella, and that may that be on Ukraine or on a whole bunch of topics, was not exactly this sort of post-populist, almost Melonian image that Jordan Bardella had tried to sell to the French public.
So Gwendoline Delbos-Corfield, what's ahead concretely for you? How do you envisage the next 5 years? Because the job of a European lawmaker means that you're not only going to sit in plenaries and vote, you also have commissions. And with this new voting bloc, what does it change? How do you see it evolving?
I mean, I am very concerned in general for Europe and for democracy in Europe. I mean, it's not just the institutions. It's rule of law, democracy, fundamental rights that are decreasing in a number of countries. We have so bad situations in Hungary and in a few others that we only focus on this one. Of course, the degradation in a few months of the situation in Slovakia with fiscal has all of our attention, and nothing is happening, and he's going very quickly, and he's doing what Orban took 10 years to do in a few months. So that is very concerning. But we also have stories we never talk about. But in fact, in Italy, in Greece, the attacks on justice, the attacks of independent bodies, the attacks of media are getting stronger and stronger. And so we have a democratic big issue in the European Union in the next 5 years.
And what about at the European? What about at the level of the European Parliament? What does it mean to have this?
Yes, I was going to say that. I mean,
Sure.
the European Parliament was the big fighter for all of this. Whenever some sanctions did come for Hungary, whenever some actions did come from the Commission and Council on any rule of law situation, and that goes back to also the death of Caruana Galizia and Jan Kuciak, it always was under the pressure of the Parliament. It was always because the Parliament pushed and really pressured Commission and Council to act, because if not on their own behalf, they never act. So the fact that this Parliament may be very weak on rule of law issues because of these three groups, because there probably is going to be a third fascist group, and the fact that it's not clear what the big group, the EPP group, the Conservatives one, where will they balance, where will they go towards? That is a big question, and if in this Parliament we don't have a strong action again, well, I don't think there will be action on the European Union.
Let's show, Gwendoline, the makeup of the new European Parliament. And there you see the parts in green and red have gotten smaller. The parts in light blue and dark blue and gray have gotten larger. What does that change a lot, other than the amount of speaking time allotted when it comes to actually making laws? Because let's not forget, this is a European Parliament that's over the years had more and more power.
Yes, I mean, yes, it's just what I said. Yes, indeed. I mean, the fact that in Parliament we don't have strong progressive forces like we used to have in the last term. We also have the group Renew that was, I mean, I disagree with the centric people on a number of issues, and specifically on environmental issue. I don't think they go strong enough. But on rule of law, they were clear allies. Most of the time, I mean 99% of the time, they were very clear allies and very strong. They have now gone to be the fifth group in the Parliament. So yes, things are bad in the Parliament, very clearly. We also have fighters of rule of law and democracy like Sophie In'Veld coming from Renew, that is no more there, and a few others. From Hungary, we have no opposition nearly anymore. So indeed, the Parliament is going to be a place where I'm not sure the voices of rule of law and democracy will be heard enough. And once again, the responsibility now will be on the shoulders of EPP, the big conservative group. Where will they go to? They have the choice to make a big progressive centrist majority that will, of course, not be very strong in progressivity, but will still stand on rule of law and democracy, or they can work more closely with certain parts of far rights. One of the choices that they are thinking about is working with ECR. You know, and ECR is winning a lot of good image in this story, because now there are two other big awful groups with very bad people. So suddenly someone like Giorgia Meloni seems a bit nicer and a bit easier to work with. And the peace in Poland also seems to be an option. This is really bad. ECR is now becoming the face of a good far right. We shouldn't have that. So if EPP chooses that path, Parliament will be in a very difficult situation. My hope is, and we heard Donald Tusk, is that someone like Donald Tusk from EPP, and we have others in EPP, that know the danger in their own country of far right, will be strong enough to say to their own group, come on, we cannot do this.
All right, it's a three-headed entity, the European Union. You have the Parliament, as we've just described it. You have the European Council, the leaders of the 27 nations, and you have the European Commission. A new 5-year term in Brussels means a reshuffle among the top jobs. Among those keeping her seat, the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. She hails from the German opposition Christian Democrats. Here you see her in the company of Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who we've mentioned. Ulrika Franca, which way, because on the campaign trail, there were a few dog whistle messages sent from Ursula von der Leyen to Giorgia Meloni and her ECR bloc. Which way will von der Leyen go?
Honestly, I can't tell you. I don't know, and I don't think we know yet. I think Gwendolyn just made a very good point about, some elements, some parts of what we used to call the far right, right-wing extremists becoming way more acceptable because the further right becomes even larger. So I think this is something that is definitely happening. But we'll see how von der Leyen and how the EPP creates coalitions. There's just one point I wanted to add, which is that I share Gwendolyn's concern over rule of law and the role that the European Parliament will no longer be able to play when it comes to rule of law. And I think this is a bigger point, together with, say, the topic of migration, than, for example, the support for Ukraine. I do not expect, and I could be wrong on this, but I do not expect these new Patriots for Europe to kind of take on European support for Ukraine as the kind of main topic where they're going to make kind of the biggest fuss, so to speak. I would expect them to not try to kind of roll things back and convince the EU to do less. They will not necessarily support for the EU to do more. So any kind of initiatives, kind of new ideas coming out of Europe, I think they will be diminished. But I would be surprised if these parties really kind of took the support to Ukraine as the kind of main target. And I think we have heard that in Bardela's statements. I think they will look at other things. Rule of law, migration, and just kind of the power of the EU that they generally want to scale back.
Okay, but what if we follow the money here for a second? Hungary, by the way, coming up in conversation here in Paris this Tuesday, what with the Paris prosecutor's office investigating suspicions of fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of property regarding the financing of Marine Le Pen's 2022 presidential election campaign. Her party denies strongly. They claim it's a witch hunt, say lawyers. After Russian financing in 2017, Le Pen had turned to Hungarian bank MKB last time around. At the time, the Financial Times reported that, according to two sources familiar with the matter, the decision to ask MKB to extend the loan to Le Pen came from Orban's inner circle, signaling a high level of direct political influence at the bank. Ulrika Franca, how much do these parties depend on Hungarian money, on Russian money?
Yeah, I mean, on the Russian financing, that is something that is known now, that Rassemblement National or Front National got funding and money from Russian banks. That is no longer a secret. On Hungary, we've just seen the reports. Absolutely, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying these are parties that are particularly keen on Europe's support for Ukraine. Of course they are. Many of those are parties with strong ties to Russia, with past funding from Russia, with a positive view towards Russia, and by the way, at the same time, a negative view and attitude towards the United States, towards NATO, very often towards Germany. So all of this is problematic. What I'm saying is that just given the current situation, and by the way, the still strong support of European citizens for Ukraine, it's fluctuating a little bit, but overall Europeans want to support Ukraine. Given that, I don't think that this is kind of the first topic they're going to take aim at. But this can, of course, change once the situation in Ukraine changes. And importantly, the moment European citizens kind of start wavering, I think, these will be the voices, these will be the first voices to say, and maybe the way we're going isn't the right one, and we need to make peace with Putin's Russia, whatever that looks like.
Thibault Musard, do you agree?
Yes, absolutely. I think the Ukraine issue is not going to be. It's not a popular one. It's rather a fringe issue that allows to get a portion of the electorate happy to get them to feel represented. So I don't think this will be on top of the agenda of the new group's policy. I think there will be much more about immigration, about cultural issues, and not so much on Ukraine. That being said, it is obvious that there is a this is a common point that they all have. Their positioning on the war in Ukraine, on the relationship with Russia, even though it's not necessarily said in the same way. So it is definitely a common point that they have a real point of differentiation between ECR and the defunct ID, now Patriots for Europe, because actually the reality is that Patriots for Europe is just a slightly enlarged identity of democracy, identity and democracy minus the AfD, but plus basically a bunch of other parties that used to be in ALDE, that used to be in ECR, and now that have joined Viktor Orban in what seems to be a sort of hostile takeover of what used to be ID.
And you heard Gwendoline Delbos-Corfield express her concern over things like freedom of the press, rule of law. Do you see any threats to the way the European Union has been run in this legislature?
Yes, I mean, there can easily be some things going backwards. At the same time, of course, on a very technical point of view, this was a term with a lot of achievements in these topics. It's the rule of law report in the Commission. It's the Council taking this much more seriously than it used to be, and a number of permanent representation that are working very seriously on this, very engaged. Civil servants having this as a priority on their agenda. It's anti-corruption tools that are stronger and stronger, and there's even an agency now for money laundering. So the tools themselves have been reinforced in this term, and you cannot just, sweep this away. So a lot is going to be in the hands of leaders, and that's where a bit the concern is. It's also in the hand of Commission. The next Commission, because of the state of number of countries and governments in countries, will be probably much less progressive than it used to be, with less stronger faces coming from the left, the central left. So there's also a questioning there. And then there's also, the dynamics in the member states and in history in the 27 countries that we don't really know about. I am very hopeful, for example, for more involvement coming from the Baltic countries. For a very long time, Baltic countries on these issues have been on a standing point, sort of being very neutral, not taking any big decisions, not fighting against Orban at all. We know that has changed. The mentality has changed. There's a big push from the people in these countries to say, we don't want the Orban style to be the European style. They are very afraid. The souvenir of the Soviet Union dictatorship is very strong still there. And they are very engaged with Ukraine. So maybe there will be involvement of Baltics, but there will be a withdrawal from maybe Netherlands that has a new government, and they were at the forefront of the fight for rule of law. So all of this is also to be foreseen in the next years. Things is very much also in the hand of the Council and on the PERM website and on the leaders' side, and it's difficult to know yet what exactly is
going to happen. If we call up Anne-Sylvaine Chessany, that map again, the graph showing what the new European Parliament looks like, we'll see that it kind of looks a little bit like here it is, like the French Parliament.
You mean
there's one block that's to the left. Yeah. There's one block that's, obviously the proportions aren't exactly the same. There's one block that's center-right, centrist or center-right. Yeah. And there's one block that's far-right. The proportions aren't exactly the same. But you've been covering the last week. Yeah. The French were asking themselves, can they do coalitions? Can they strike deals? You heard the terms in which Gwendoline was talking about how compromises were made during the last legislature. All the discussions we're having about Europe.
you can maybe apply them now to to France.
Will France ever be like Europe? Is my question.
Oh my God, I think France.
Or it's just institutionally impossible.
Institutionally, is going to be a very tough moment for France because coalition is really not in the tradition of the Fifth Republic, especially not in recent history. So yes, they will have to learn the art of coalition, and I think Macron is trying to, in his grand, design, is trying to build this grand coalition, a bit a la German style coalition. I think the problem is, as Gwendoline says, it's going to be down to the council as well. And coming back to France, it's the big question is whether Macron is going to be paralyzed and will have the power of initiative. That's a big question mark as well in this current legislation.
That's an interesting question. I want to bring in Ulrike Frank on this. Ulrike, the last 7 years, Macron's been informally vying, especially after the departure of Angela Merkel, for the informal title of President of Europe. We saw his second speech at the Sorbonne in the past year. After calling the snap election that backfired miserably, how weakened is he in the eyes of other Europeans?
Well, I'm going to say he's less weakened than we all thought he would be when he called the elections. So, of course, yes, he is weakened in the sense that he has less support in parliament than he used to. But of course, he never had, not never, but he didn't have the majority before this election either. But given that he actually, so his party groupings got more votes than many people thought, and that Rassemblement National didn't do as well as pretty much everybody expected. In a way, he is, less weakened than we all thought he would be. So I think, interestingly enough, with this parliament in France, I'm now talking, I think this whole idea of les domaines réservés, so the reserved domains, the reserved areas where the president really still acts, even if the government is from a different party or party coalition. So foreign and security policy, foreign and defense policy. I think this will hold. And so I think Macron, in a way, will still go to meetings and give big speeches.
So, Ulrike, is he still the figurehead for federalism in Europe? Is he the poster child for more Europe, as we say?
I think him personally, he will still try to drive this ambition for Europe and the EU. But yeah, let's be clear. He is coming towards the end of his mandate. He has lost support in France, so he can't quite play the same role. But I think he will still try to influence the agenda. I think everybody now, interestingly enough, is looking towards Donald Tusk as someone who can kind of move Europe forward. That is an interesting development, and we'll see what that does.
And Sylvain Chassani?
I think Ulrike is right. I think he will probably be able to exist on the European stage and the world stage if we assume that there is some sort of centre left or a new Front Populaire kind of prime minister or kind of grand coalition, or even if even if it's blocked, he can actually exist on a foreign policy front. The bigger question, I guess, is more when you have new initiatives that would involve more spending, like Eurobond or more military aid, or that is.
They were trying to get the frugal countries, as they call them, to keep on with this mutualization of debt.
Yeah, so I think that is going to be limited, but because the government will have control of the budget and so on. Plus the big question mark on the health of the French economy and whether or not it could be prone to a crisis. I mean, if you have a high tax and spending government, and France has got this big problem of deficit and is in talks with the Commission and has to agree some sort of a tax cut, a spending cuts program. That could be a major source of problem for Europe.
So, Thibault Muziek, let me ask you, who's in charge of Europe these days?
Well, that's the problem. We never really knew. There was always an issue about who was in charge of Europe. Like, according to Kissinger, who do I call when I want to call Europe? I think this is really a problem now because the Franco-German couple is not working together well. Each of the leaders in the Franco-German couple is weakened right now. And the other two...
Olaf Scholz just passed a budget, though. Is he on the quiet getting stronger?
He passed a budget, but his group took a beating in the European elections as well. And he's, the coalition is not doing very well. So that leaves us with Spain, which has its own problems with Mr. Sanchez, Italy with Giorgia Meloni, who is strong, but who is not accepted by everybody. I think we had a good example of this this evening, and Donald Tusk in Poland, who also has his own difficulties, but looks like another strong leader in Europe. But neither Poland nor Italy look like, I wouldn't call that natural leaders, because that would be very contemptuous towards countries that have a great past in making Europe. But still, they do not have. They do not represent 40% of the two together. Do not represent 42% of Europe's GDP like France and Germany do. So that makes decision making in the Council more complicated. So the president of the Council, who is supposed to be Mr. Costa from Portugal, will have a difficult job, putting everybody together under these circumstances.
There is this feeling, and Sylvain Chassani, when you look at Sunday's results here in France, each side can claim to be a little bit of a winner. The centrists didn't do as badly as they thought. The left had an upset win, but falls far short of an outright majority. And the far right, it doesn't increase as much as it thought it would, but it still has a record number of members of parliament. When you look at the far right, going from strength to strength in each election, and even across the channel in the UK, where Labour's just won a massive landslide, but lost votes. Is the far right going to continue to go from strength to strength?
There's clearly momentum behind far right in France and in other places in Europe, and it's clearly concerning because we're talking about, countries, nationalistic, movements who wants to, undo whatever's being done in terms of, European integration. So they're fundamentally anti-European integration. I would be a bit more positive about the French election because what we've seen, and I think Ulrike has kind of expressed that, I think the massive rejection of far-right ideas in France has also been quite, it's also a matter for optimism, I would say. And so there is still a lot of resistance against these ideas. And so that could be, it was halted. The rise of the RN has been halted. Now maybe it's only temporary. We'll see. But
Gwendoline Delbos-Corfield, is there, in your camp, the Greens, is there introspection? Are you happy because of the upset win, or are you nervous when you look at the number of votes in both the European and the French elections that went to the far right, a record number in each case?
No, I've been concerned about France for a very long time. I even asked for a study coming from two lawyers that work on rule of law in France and in Europe, Laurent Pech and Sébastien Platon, and I worked on the capacity of the state in France to resist an authoritarian shock like we had in Hungary. Where I really am not agreeing with what I've just heard is that I'm very pessimist. I think that France is not at all capable for the moment. The political landscape in France, the media, everyone, nobody knows how to deal with coalition and parliamentary work. In France, the parliament has been despised for years and years and years. It's really not functioning as the European Parliament at all. The Fifth Republic is a rigid structure that is entitling the president to so many powers. We could even see the president not changing anything for the next year because he can really try to use the Fifth Republic in the way that he wants. And I think that these chaotic, ungovernable moments where people get defiant and more defiant And French society is a very different society. A number of polls and studies showed that the French don't believe in science anymore as much as they did, don't believe in their politicians anymore. So it's a very bad context for this. So I really am very concerned about a win of Marine Le Pen or someone else in 2027. So I think that we need a lot of introspection. Everyone, indeed, as it was said, the people resisted, and we are now, in fact, at 30% of people believing in far-right ideas, which is already a lot. But if the political level and the mediatic level are not answering the challenges,
it could go higher.
Concerned.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Gwendoline Delbos-Corfield, thank you so much for joining us from Brussels. I want to thank Thibaut Musergue for being with us, Ulrika Franke, and Sylvain Chassani. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.